And good evening, and welcome to today's edition of Politics 101. Want to welcome everyone to the show. Want to apologize for yesterday. Yesterday, we were expecting Mr. Joe Harmon on, and he canceled at the last moment. And so therefore we were not able to come on yesterday. I want to apologize for that. But welcome this evening. This evening we are going to be looking at what's happening at GECOM. We have talked on this program about what's happening at GECOM for the last couple of weeks. And today we have GECOM commissioners, Mr. Vincent Alexander, who is no stranger to this program, and Mr. Desmond Trotman, two of the three opposition-appointed commissioners. And we're going to be talking about a range of issues at GECOM, what's happening with the process of recruiting a chief elections officer and other senior officers at GECOM. We heard some names in the last couple of weeks surfacing. There's been an issue about the process of shortlisting, the process of interviewing. We know that the WPA and Commissioner Desmond Trotman introduced the motion to get an independent committee to do the interviewing. So there's lots to talk about as far as GECOM is concerned, and we're going to get into that. Later on, we're going to open the lines. We're going to open the phone so you can talk directly to the commissioners, pose your questions to them. So those of you who have questions, stand by, because we're going to open the phones later on. Welcome again. Welcome if you're in Guyana. It's in November and it's getting a little wet in Guyana. Getting into the December rain. Of course, we know in the old days, we had May, June rain, and then we had December, January. But now with this global warming and all that kind of thing, we get rain anytime. That's quite an issue as we go forward. But welcome if you're in Guyana, and welcome if you're in the Greater Caribbean, if you are in North America, Canada, the United States, of course. If you're in Europe, we have some people who join us faithfully every evening. From London, England. They are quite a few hours ahead of the rest of us, and so they make that sacrifice to come on. So welcome everybody. And as you know, GECOM is pivotal to the PPP's plans of domination. The control of GECOM is obviously very high up on their agenda. And we notice immediately after the election, they criminalization of GECOM staff, the firing of the CEO and others. So it's clear that as part of the larger politics of domination, GECOM is very central. So we're going to talk to the commissioners about that and a number of issues. Let me welcome Vincent Alexander. He's here. Vincent, good evening and welcome to Politics 101. Is Vincent Alexander there with us? Yes.
Yes, good evening and thank you for welcoming me.
And how are you doing, Vincent?
Not bad at all.
Okay. Okay. Let's start our conversation with the present. We know that GECOM has embarked on recruiting the chief election officer, candidates to the chief election officer, the deputy chief election officer, any other position?
The assistant chief elections officer, the chief accountant, the voter registration manager, the research officer.
So there is quite a bit yes. There, the entire top brass of GECOM, the entire top brass of GECOM. And from what we've been reading and listening to in the media, there seems to be quite a lot of applicants.
Well, we have a total of 490 applicants for the positions.
That is for all the positions or just for the
positions? Yes.
For all the positions. And since you've been at GECOM, have you gone through a recruitment process as large as this?
No, not as large. We've never had so many vacancies at the same time. I've gone through a recruitment process where we probably had 3 or 4 vacancies. This one is about 7.
And if you can bring our listeners up to speed, or viewers up to speed, as to what led to this large vacancy pool. We know, of course, that the chief elections officer was fired, the deputy chief elections officer was fired, Mr. Mingo, I think, was fired. Tell us the circumstances surrounding the firing of those officers.
Well, as we know, those officers were fired in keeping with the promise of the People's Progressive Party to clean up GECOM. I don't use the word fired for the reason that there was an effort, in fact, to fire them, which I would call a dismissal. But based on the internal decision-making process, they pulled back from the dismissal and terminated them in keeping with the contractual provisions, which says that anyone can be terminated with due notice and paid his or her benefits. So those officers were not fired in the strict sense, the strict legal sense, not dismissed. They were terminated and paid their benefits. But from the PPP did say publicly and internally that they'll get rid of them at all costs. So having failed to get rid of them by dismissals, because we were challenging that, we felt that there was no legal basis for the dismissals. And in fact, we took the position that if you were dismissing them, then due process had to be followed. And due process meant they had to be given a hearing. And we took the argument further that if they were to be given a hearing, you could not allow the commissioners who were themselves calling for them to be fired to be the ones who participated in the hearing. So that caused a problem for them. Lowenfield himself went to court on this matter. And at that point, they withdrew the motion for dismissal and asked for termination in keeping with the contract. And those 3 persons were then terminated and pay their benefits.
You said that the PPP said that they were going to be gotten rid of at all costs. The PPP has 3 members on the commission. The opposition has 3 appointed members on the commission. It meant that the chairperson would have voted with the PPP.
That's correct.
Yeah. And for those of us who may not have been following what has happened in GECOM, we've seen the chairperson on a number of these crucial issues voting with the PPP. As in your time, you've been on the commission for how long, Vincent? 2006, going back?
From 2007.
2007.
2007, it's now 14 years.
Right, so you've been there for 14 years. Have you ever seen, because you would have served under Suraj Bali, and who was before Suraj Bali?
Joe Singh. I served from Suraj Bali.
You served from Suraj Bali. Have you ever, as the chairperson, ever voted with one block so regularly? Have you seen that trend since you've been?
No, that has not been the case. Suraj Bali always sought to have a consensus. Most of the things that came before the commission during Suraj Bali's term were determined, and he proudly always said it, were determined largely by consensus.
Yes, that's my recollection too. And I spoke with Suraj Bali after he left, and he was telling me what a hell of a job the chairperson of GECOM has, and he talked about his approach of consensus that he saw as really the shining light of his tenure, and he spoke about 2015 election and the 2011 election and how things were. I mean, those were like the 2020 elections. They were as controversial, but insisted on consensus. All right, let's come back to the present. So the normal process is that the commissioners would go through the applications and then do the shortlisting. And then you would do the interviewing and then make the final appointment.
Actually,
go ahead.
On previous occasions, the shortlisting was more or less done by the Secretariat.
Okay.
They would bring the entire list, however, to us. And if we felt that they had incorrectly omitted or incorrectly included someone, then we would just make a decision on that. But they did the background work of shortlisting based on established criteria. That was then brought to the commission. We then convened what was called then an administrative committee, which committee did the interviews using an instrument, a score sheet, and we will then make a report to the commission. The commission will then deliberate on that report and make the final decision. In most instances, the report that was submitted was accepted by the commission. I only remember one instance, the instance of Vishnu Prasad, where the score sheets favored Vishnu Prasad, but the commission took a decision that Roxanne Myers was the better candidate.
And you mean each commissioner has turns in a score sheet and then you guys tabulate it?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what happened in the past.
That's what happened in the past. How effective is that process, given the political divide, given that the commissioners are quote unquote appointed by the political parties? How reliable is that process?
It's a highly flawed process. It's a highly flawed process because though people have score sheets, they can insert any score which they wish to. And in fact, it's not hypothetical. We have had instances where people have been scored as much as 100%. So that the partisan nature of the commission comes through in those score sheets. So it's a highly flawed process. And very often it's left to the chairperson to create the balance on those matters. We did have instances where there was consensus based on the score sheet for particular positions, but we did also have instances where one clearly saw that persons were favored and were given high scores as opposed to the persons who were not favored who were given low scores. And that was exactly what occurred in the Vishnu case versus Myers case. Myers was eminently qualified with a master's with a B plus average. Vishnu was not so eminently qualified. He had a master's with a C minus, I think it was. And yet he was scored higher than Myers. But the commission, when it came to the commission, the chairman took the position with those who scored Myers higher. As a consequence, Myers was hired.
Myers was
So
able to
it's
get the
it's a flawed system. It is subject to uh, partisan political views, I think. I'm prepared to accept and admit that. And it leaves the deciding fact, the chairman as the deciding fact.
Yeah. Let's talk, Vincent, about the criteria, for these positions. The commissioners, I understand, have a big say in that too. And just as partisan considerations can seep into the scoring, if we go back to the beginning of the process in working out the criteria for the positions, my understanding is that partisan considerations seeped into that. Am I correct?
Well, I would say almost everything in GECOM is partisan unless there is a coincidence of interest. Almost everything is partisan.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
even if I argue that my position is not partisan, uh, it will be perceived to be. And not only would it be perceived to be in GECOM, but the fractured population will also see it to be partisan. So everything is seen to be partisan, even when it is not. So that yes, partisan interest can seep into the establishment of the criteria. And in fact, on this last occasion, uh, there was a difference in view. So whilst there were those commissioners, I'm told I wasn't present on that occasion, who thought that certain offices required 10 years of experience, there were other commissioners who thought that those offices required 6 years of experience. And so that, in fact, was decided on with the involvement of the chairperson, and 10 years prevailed.
10 years of experience of what?
10 years of experience in a senior managerial position in an election machinery.
Wow, 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 wow. That's not something that the ordinary citizen, the ordinary executive has. You obviously, you first of all are saying that the person who worked at GECOM as an edge, the person who worked long on GECOM as a bigger edge. Um, Speak to that. It's something.
Two things about that. It seems to suggest a preference for people already in the system.
Yes.
And the fact of the matter is that if one looks back at GECOM, until now, all of those who became CEOs came from the system. As far as I can remember, Stanley Singh came from the system. Goku Budu came from the system. Keith Lowenfield came from the system. So it seems set for people who are already in the system, except that on the last occasion and on this occasion, we have extended the advertisements globally so that there is a possibility that persons who are not from the system, but who may be from an electoral system with the required experience, could be identified. And in that regard, we do have some non-Guyanese who are not resident in Guyana as well, who have indeed applied.
Yeah, this whole question of cleaning up GECOM and trying to tone down the partisan temperature at GECOM. We saw that report from the CARICOM people who were here, who basically nailed GECOM to the cross, suggest incestuousness and all of that kind of stuff. In against the backdrop of that, would it not make sense to set the criteria to not benefit people unnecessarily who are in the system? What do you think of that?
Well, I think it makes some sense, but I was taught years ago that politics is not about sense. And that the extent to which people are driven by politics, the extent to which nonsensical things could prevail.
Yeah. All right. There was this proposal by the WPA and others. I noticed the Village Voice newspaper embraced it. That an independent panel, given the flawed nature of the system of recruitment, and one of your brother commissioner put forward this idea of an independent commission. First of all, and you obviously support it. First of all, explain to our audience how that an independent, quote unquote independent, because we're talking about Guyana, how does an independent panel produce a superior outcome to the one that is there now, that's been used?
One would expect an independent panel not to be as partisan and a priori not to be related to people who would have applied. If GECOM advertises the nature of the body politics of the nation, provides for people who are partisan in GECOM to start the act of collusion at the point of advertisement. But a non-partisan panel would be selected after that point. So they would have had no possibility of involvement at the point of the people putting in their applications. So that's the first thing about that panel. Secondly, one would seek to have the kind of panel that would not have the same kind of interest in appointing particular persons as a partisan commissioner may have, so that the scoring is likely to be more objective, and the meritocracy may prevail in terms of the persons who are identified to be recommended to fill the positions. And I say recommended because the panel will only be making a recommendation to the commission. The ultimate responsibility remains with the commission. But one has to bear in mind that whether I like it or not, given what Guyanese has said on all sides of the divide, that GECOM is tainted. And even if the commissioners turn out not to be partisan, the perception still persists. And so it's in GECOM's interest to do something to show that it doesn't want to be seen to be partisan in what it's doing, and therefore the public is likely confidence to do the interviewing process and have them then submit that to GECOM for final decision.
Mm-hmm.
So it's in
one would assume
GECOM's image interest, so to speak, what may be considered to be a reform process if you were to engage a non-partisan panel. Incidentally, in the course of that discussion today, a proposal which has been rejected by the PPP nominated commissioners, I made the proposition that, all right, if you want to involve commissioners, you can involve them, but you can add to the commissioners other persons so that there's the flavor there of persons who are not known to be perceived or known to be partisan to help in the process. That too, so far, has been rejected.
So both has been rejected. Oh wow! You've already said that politics is not about common sense, because I want
I
to
would say
ask.
so far, for me, it is.
We seem to be having some technical difficulties here. We're not hearing Mr. Alexander. Are you hearing me?
You're not. Yeah, I'm hearing you. I'm
Okay.
hearing you. Are you hearing me?
Okay. Okay. No, I was saying that I was just about to ask what could be the motive, if not directly partisan, to reject both of these proposals. I mean, the first proposal is very reasonable. The second proposal is even more reasonable because it seems to be a consensus position. The second position seems to say, okay, let's go for the hybrid. We're going to keep the commissioners, but we're going to have some independent people. I know it's asking you the obvious question, but why? Why not? Mr. Alexander, are you hearing me? Yeah, we seem to have lost Mr. Alexander there until we get him back. That seems to be quite a reasonable position, that you have a mixed panel, a panel of commissioners and some independent people. You can't go wrong. Both sides get part of what they want. Obviously, the PPP side wants the panels, the commissioners to be part of the process. The opposition side wants some independent people. And it seems to me the mixed panel of independent people and commissioners is a reasonable proposal. And if they reject that proposal, including the chair, because the chair could be the consensus builder here, but even the chair apparently has rejected that position. Now, the question here is, Mr. Alexander said, is not just transparency, but to be seen to be transparent, to give the public perception that you're trying to get beyond the partisan outlook at GECOM. My goodness me. We are really up against it. Clearly, what the PPP is trying to do with the apparent collusion of the chairperson is really to take over GECOM. It's that much is clear. Mr. Alexander, you back with us? Are you hearing me? You're hearing me?
Yes, I'm hearing you.
Okay, good. Yes. So that reasonable compromise was rejected. So where does that leave things?
Yes. Well, as I said, I for me, this is a matter that has to be further interrogated. I am not yet. Chairperson asked the question, though she took a position that the commissioners should do the interviews. She asked the question, what happened in the past? She doesn't know what happened in the past.
Oh,
But I intend to pursue with her what happened in the past, where there's evidence of commissioners scoring people as high as 100%, to show her good reason why she should give a second view on this matter. But I think on this matter, it's also important for the public out there, to whom we are responding in a large measure, to also raise their voices in support of something that is in the best interest of GECOM and Guyana.
GECOM and Guyana. In case you're just joining us, this is Politics 101. Tonight we're talking GECOM. We have Commissioner Vincent Alexander. Commissioner Desmond Trotman should have been on with us, but he seems to be having some technical difficulties. If he manages to sort that out, he will join us. But for now, we're talking here to Vincent Alexander, and we're going to open the phones in a little while so that you can pose your questions directly to Vincent. Vincent, recently, two academics from the University of the West Indies, one of them was part of the CARICOM team that came to quote unquote observe the recount, made some damning charges against the appeal court, but also against GECOM. And one of those charges was that GECOM had the power to act and they did not act. People seem to be reading that both ways. Opposition, meaning coalition supporters, are thinking that they're saying that she could have acted and named Mr. Granger the president. And DPP supporters are thinking, they're saying that she could have acted and named them. Help us sort through your reading of that intervention.
All right, let me say, before I get to the point of the question which you asked, let me say that one of those persons who headed the CARICOM team wrote in her report that there was no evidence of dead persons being voted for and overseas Guyanese being voted for. I don't exactly blame her for writing that in the report, except that what she wrote is not factual. And it is GECOM itself that has to take responsibility for what she wrote, because we had already received from the chief immigration officer reports showing that there were persons whose names were ticked off as having voted who had not returned to Guyana. And we had already received reports from the registrar of births and deaths showing that persons whose names were ticked off had deaths had been registered. But GECOM did not make this information available to the good lady. And therefore, that information did not find itself into the report, which she wrote, and she wrote quite the opposite. So I thought I'd make that clear, that I don't necessarily blame her for that, but GECOM has to take responsibility because GECOM did not make the information available. This question which has arisen about GECOM could have acted, it's mired in lots of misunderstanding. Lots of misunderstanding. GECOM has processes. And I don't think the people who are commenting on these processes themselves are fully aware of what the processes are. One of the things that went terribly wrong at these last elections was that the Region 4, District 4, seemed to be absorbed into the central machinery, when in fact, under the law, up to the point of declaration for District 4, they are separate and apart from the central machinery, so that the chairperson could not have erred if she did not intervene in District 4, because the process does not provide for her to intervene in District 4. What the process provides for her to do is to oversee the delivery of those results to the commission for the commission's determination. And so I think almost everybody got that wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Region 4 happened to be physically located where the central body was located, and everybody who should be doing their job centrally left their jobs and became caught up in Region 4, where they ought not to have been, because that is not what the process provides for. From Region 1 through 10, except 4, there was no central involvement. They all did what they had to do. And the processes does provide, even if something is done wrong, even if there's a wrong declaration, that declaration is not a final result. It comes to the commission, and the commission makes the final determination. We have a control mechanism that we instituted in 2011 and we perfected in 2015. And that control mechanism is that, separate and apart from the CEO, who gets copies of the statements of poll and is required to computerize those results, the commissioners themselves were recipients of statements of poll, and we were signing off of those statements, signing off on those statements, and having signed off on them, each so-called side got a copy. So we were being given authentic results as commissioners. So we were in a position ourselves to determine what the results should be. However, when the issue started in Region 4, colleague commissioners nominated by the PPP abandoned that exercise and sought to intervene in Region 4, which is not really what should occur.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, we did not complete the job of receiving, signing off of, and being custodians of the results. And so the commissioners collectively denied themselves of the opportunity of being able to have statements of polls that will allow them to say, if a false result was brought, that the result is false, take it back. We denied ourselves that.
Yeah.
We got involved in all of the hoorah and all of the noise downstairs. So that's another issue that occurred. So that we could not do what we were supposed to do because we denied ourselves of the documentation that's required to do what we're supposed to do.
And if I may cut you before you go on, you denied yourself, they denied all of you to do what you did in 2011.
Correct. Correct.
Right.
We would have been in a position to make a statement if false results were brought to us. We denied ourselves that. And so I sometimes say that all that happened after that was contrived. And the 5 months so often talked about could have been avoided if we'd allowed the system to work. We did not allow it to work, and we had to go into emergency drive that took us 5 months, and then people are blamed for those 5 months, when in fact those who are blaming the people could have made a difference if they had done what they had the authority to do.
Let me ask you this,
The other
Vincent.
issue that is
okay, go ahead. You go ahead. And then you've done.
The other issue which was of concern to me in the process is that there was a matter filed in the court and seeking an injunction.
Yeah.
The court gave an order in which the judge said, look, I cannot tell GECOM how to do its work, but I can tell GECOM that there's a process that they have by law that they should follow, and the extent to which you're complaining they have not followed that process, I'm instructing GECOM to go back and follow the process. At that time, the chairperson was in court and gave the court an undertaking that she will ensure that the process is corrected. From a procedural perspective, the officers of District 4 went back and did what the court said they should do. There are complaints that what they did was not a perfect portrayal, that people couldn't see properly, but they did post statements of poll as was required. However, the chairperson took the position that her undertaking could put her in a position of contempt of court, and therefore she would not act until certain things happen to relieve her of that problem. I do not agree that there was ever an order that could have caused her to be in contempt of court, and therefore in that regard, again, there was a point in time when she could have taken certain actions that she did not take under the pretext that she would be held in contempt. So that's my explanation of the various points at which people don't quite understand what happened. They don't quite know the system. Some don't care to know the system. And I think the chairperson was extraordinarily cautious about her own well-being by claiming that she may be held in contempt of court. And I don't think that there was such an order of the court that could have caused her to be held in contempt.
After Region 4 did what the court said they should do procedurally, they posted the stuff and so on. People said they couldn't see. And you said the chairperson could have acted. What? Acted and do what? At that particular point.
Those results could have been brought to the commission.
To the commission.
With the other 9 results.
The other 9 districts.
It is then would have been the function of the commission to determine whether what was before them reflected what they would have possessed in the statements of poll that they were being issued with. But a part of the problem was that the commissioners did not have all of the results because they abandoned their function to go and intervene in Region 4 and did not continue to collect statements of poll right through to the end. Exactly the statement of poll for the East Coast, where no documentation was found in the boxes, are the same statements of poll that the commissioners did not collect because they abandoned their posts.
They abandoned.
That's why I say that this seemed to be contrived.
Sisters and brothers, viewers, listeners, I hope you all are listening carefully. Yes, I always say on this program that things we take for granted, we need to examine them further so that we're armed with the truth. You see, here's Mr. Alexander breaking this thing down. For us, I'm saying that I have learned. I was making the mistake of conflating Region 4 with the big thing. But here Vincent is making this crucial point, which is that GECOM cannot intervene in Region 4 in a way that the PPP wanted GECOM to intervene. And the fact that the commissioners on the PPP side abandoned their role, and so therefore the matter could not come to them in a way that it went to Mr. Alexander and others in 2011, and Mr. Alexander could have found discrepancies in what Mr. Gokul Budu presented. If you were saying Mr. Mingu fiddled with the numbers, then those numbers will have to go to the commissioners and they will have to look at Mr. Mingo's number against the statements of poll that they have. Am I correct there?
Yes.
Yes. And if you're claiming fraud, then the fraud would have been detected. It was done before in 2011. So I hope you all are listening carefully, because I think even supporters of the coalition do not have the story right, because we have pieces from people, as you said, who have no understanding of internal processes. You've been there for 14 years. And so you understand the process. So when those academics, my brother and sister academics, said that GECOM could have intervened, it's a reflection of a less than thorough understanding of the process. You know, and as Vincent said, in some regards, you can't blame them, because they are intervening in a process that has a long history. And that more than most Caribbean countries, Guyana's elections commission has to have these layers that you may not find in other territories in the Caribbean. Vincent, let me ask you to explain another thing that our people get confused about, and that's the recount order. Now, there's argument that the recount order was unconstitutional, but at some point, it was decided that that was the way to go. And then once you drafted that recount order was as if it is law. So in a sense, it was a legal process, a legitimate process. Explain for us there. On the one hand, this thing is unconstitutional. But then on the other hand, you used it. And you coming out of it, you have a body of information there that you were not able to get as commissioners, but the recount brought out a body of information there that, in a sense, tell the story in the other direction. I know I've said a lot there and it may be confusing, but disentangle it for us.
All right, let me make 2 points. There were 2 attempts, there were 2 attempts at recount, an unsuccessful and a successful.
Mm-hmm.
The first attempt at recount was based on the agreement between leader of the opposition then, Jagdeo, and President Granger. When the order for that one was drafted and taken to the AG's chambers, the chief parliamentary officer advised that we couldn't do a recount based on the intervention of these 2 persons. In other words, we couldn't do a recount that had its anchor in an agreement between these 2 persons. So that one was abandoned. The team that was here for that left the country. They actually left. GECOM then took it upon itself, based on provisions of the Representation of the People's Act and or the Elections Act, to do a recount under, I think, is Section 18. I may be wrong. Where we felt that there was a provision that we can do recount under that section. We have to consider that recount constitutional insofar as the courts at the highest level rule on its constitutionality. So I don't think we can now, I mean, I might have a view about it, but from a strictly legal perspective, the court ruled it was constitutional. The difficulty I had, and still have, is that in one of the rulings of the court, it was specified that nothing should be done in contravention to the conduct of the count prior to the recount. In other words, the same rules in terms of what's a valid vote and so forth should apply. I know for a fact that during the process of the recount, from time to time, we took decisions after review of the validity of a vote that conflicted with the validity of a vote as was previously decided. This had nothing to do with the dead or with the overseas voters. It had to do with whether you're ticking the box or outside the box and things like that. Whether you write your name on the ballot and things like that. We reviewed those things. And for me, that process of review flew in the face of the CCJ's judgment, which says that nothing of that sort should be reviewed. You simply wanted to do a count to ensure that the previous count was acceptable. And the order provided for some other things, like the dead and things like those, that we discerned. But they argue that even if you discern those things, you cannot change the count. The count is simply about those X's in the box and the availability of the statements of the ballot papers, and that the things you discover, which in our view the order said could be taken into consideration during the recount process, their rule could only be taken into consideration in the petition process. So for me, yes, there was constitutionality, but at the same time, we did things that conflicted with what I saw the court ruling to be, and therefore we made unconstitutional in some regards the recount. But unfortunately, it was ruled that these things were not taken into consideration as far as I'm concerned. And I don't think they were even properly argued during the case.
During the case. The recount order talked about an audit. It may not have used the word, or it may have used the word. It didn't use the word audit, but my understanding was that when I read it over and over, was that it went beyond looking for X's in boxes. Am I wrong there?
All right, let me repeat what I said.
Yeah.
Let me repeat what I said. Our understanding when we crafted that recount order was that we were not merely recounting ballots, but you were checking on the validity of ballots. And therefore, we could have rejected ballots that were not valid because there was no supporting documentation to show that the person actually voted. And we got to that point. But the court ruled otherwise.
Otherwise.
The court says, no, you can't do that in the recount. You have to wait for a petition to do that. Let's accept the court ruled that way. But the court also ruled that you could not change the manner in which determinations were made about votes cast. And we did from time to time make changes. And so what we did fly in the face of what the court said, in my view. And therefore, we ourselves, by that, would have made the recount unconstitutional.
There you have it, audience. I hope that I know it's at a certain level very complex stuff. But I think this is the best explanation I have heard about what happened there at GECOM. And I think while some people may argue that this is old business, it is not, because it can happen again. In fact, the chances of it happening again are very, 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 very high. The other thing is that the matter is before the court in one way or the other. It seems to me, from my layman standpoint, that the courts got itself in a tangle over that recount order. On the one hand, it accepted this raw count from the recount order. On the other hand, it's saying that the recount order cannot supersede the Representation of the People's Act. And to me, there is some confusion there where the court is talking out of both sides of its mouth. But I'm not a lawyer. It's just my reading of it. But any comment on that?
David, I would like to say, you said that the matter is
before the
not
court.
simple, not easily understood.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I agree with you. I would like to invite listeners who have interest in this matter to visit the Public Free Library and or the archives, where I lodged my own written view on this matter in a document called The Case for a Non-Declaration. The Case for a Non-Declaration. I lodged copies with the Public Free Library, and I lodged copies with the archives. And so I'm saying the persons who have an interest, they can go to those two places. Other persons can also come to the Forbes Burnham Foundation, and they can have a copy to read. We can photocopy a copy for them. The Forbes Burnham Foundation. The Case for Non-Declaration.
Mm-hmm.
In that case,
yes, go ahead.
I made a particular additional point we haven't discussed.
Go ahead. Are we?
There are.
We seem to, Vincent seemed to be breaking up there. Okay.
Which I said coincidentally are the same boxes for which we did not collect statements.
Yes.
Those 47 boxes, the documentation completely was missing. My argument was that people voted at those places and should not be disenfranchised. But that the absence of the documentation for those boxes could not validate the ballots. And therefore, at minimum, GECOM should have held a by-election, so to speak,
by-election, I remember
in that
proposal.
area to allow the people not to be disenfranchised, but at the same time to allow us to be able to validate the votes coming from that area. That was another one of my contentions. And you will find that in my document, the case for non-declaration, that those votes could not be considered valid, but you cannot disenfranchise people.
You cannot disenfranchise.
And therefore, you have to go back and give them the opportunity to exercise their franchise.
Yeah. And so when Mr. Lowenfield said, look, given all of this stuff, I cannot certify this election, he stops at that point. And it was for GECOM now to say, given this suggestion of a by-election may be one way to go. Did they even deliberate it, Vincent?
No, that wasn't deliberated. That wasn't deliberated. It wasn't accepted for deliberation, though I did make a written submission. It wasn't deliberated. GECOM simply rejected Lowenfield's intervention,
yes.
And the court subsequently struck down his intervention. And that's another issue that we ought to understand. Lowenfield presented a report based on what he thought was his interpretation of a decision of the appeal court. He gave that report after the appeal court gave its ruling.
Yes.
Interpreting what he thought was in the appeal court. The CCJ subsequently reversed the decision of the appeal court and therefore would have struck down what Lowenfield brought forward. But we need to understand the time when Lowenfield brought forward what he brought forward, he brought it forward on the basis of his interpretation of a decision of the appeal court. An interpretation which was subsequently clarified at the level of the CCJ and did not coincide with his view.
Vincent Alexander, and I hope that our brother and sister from the University of the West Indies, that they're listening tonight, because I think they would be helped in understanding the larger process of GECOM and the courts and the entire elections process. You know, there are those of us who have been fighting up in this thing for decades and still have not gotten it right. And you know, what I found interesting about the summary of what our brother and sister present was that it lacked that in-depth study and analysis of the process as a whole. Um, Rather, I think they were bites here and bites there without a comprehensive understanding of the process. We're going to open the phones now.
Let me make another point, David, on that in
Yes,
that
go ahead.
regard.
Yeah.
In their report, they seem to have referenced the fact that President Granger called for the appeal court in Ghana to be the final court in certain matters. And they said, look, this is political and that it correlates with some things that happen. I want to make a different point.
Yeah.
Our legal system has some peculiarities at two levels. At the level of constitutional law, particularly our electoral system, and the level at land law. In the case of land law, the education system, the Council of Legal Education, has recognized the fundamental difference. And so a Guyanese student going to the UManlin Law School or any of the law schools is tutored separately in relation to property, land law, on something called conveyancing, which is not practiced in the English-speaking Caribbean. It's something we inherited from the Dutch. And so our students are separated and taught that separately. I would argue that the way in which that is peculiar and ought to be taught separately also identifies with elements of our electoral system being peculiar and ought to be dealt with probably separately, but certainly is not dealt with in a manner to make lawyers, even probably our own lawyers, sufficiently proficient in that aspect of our law, because it's so different from the rest of the Caribbean that has a first past the post system.
Yeah.
And so we have to consider whether lawyers who are not practicing in Guyana and who may not have been exposed to the constitutional law at the University of Guyana are sufficiently versed in constitutional law as it relates to Guyana to be making pronouncements. And that is one reason why one could argue that though we accept CCJ as our final court, that it may not be the wisest thing, unless special arrangements are made to have them preside over matters of conveyancing and electoral matters, some elements of them, which are very peculiar to Guyana.
Yes, and Vincent, you know, I want to bear you out even as I ask the operator to put the number up so that people can be alerted. So you can call in and ask questions of Mr. Vincent Alexander on a range of matters in relation to the electoral system, what's happening at GECOM, with the recruitment, and the legal system, the judicial system as it relates to election. You know, Vincent, I grew up in politics close to Guyana, who, like you, is very versed in the law, even though he is not a practicing lawyer. And I know. And you remember when sometimes Guyana would go to court and he would be admitted to the bar to argue cases. And I remember him, especially when it came to election laws. He would go to the lawyers, the practicing lawyers, and point things out to them. you know, because what he had was an understanding, and still has, an understanding of the electoral process and its evolution, and also an understanding of how the law interfaces and intersects with it. And it is a peculiar skill that a lot of practicing lawyers don't have. And, many people, I myself asked you at one point, are you a lawyer? Because I would listen to the way in which you explain these things. And it reminds me so much about Quiana's approach, bringing together that understanding of the electoral process and the law, So you're right. Maybe, not maybe, I want to support Mr. Granger's intervention, that it's something that we need to look at, because it could get us in the tangle that we have found ourselves in. Please, if you have any questions, please call 624-9722, 624-9722, and raise your questions with Mr. Alexander. Vincent, is there anything in this whole conversation that I have not asked, but that you think is important for us to know?
We haven't discussed, and probably shouldn't get too involved in that, the whole question of the kind of charges that were brought against the electoral officials. Probably it's, from an ethical perspective, it's not the right time for us to get deep. But I think that if we were to discuss those, we would also find out a number of things. One point I would make is, you notice the police ended up going to the court to get access to the statements of poll.
Yes.
If the GECOM commissioners had stayed the course, there would have been absolutely no need for the police to go to the court to get the statements, because those commissioners could have availed, because they were part of the process of these charges, could have availed their statements for the purpose of evidence.
Yeah.
So we see where things went wrong. We see where things went wrong.
Yeah.
We got a call, Dr. Hines.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, good night, Dr. Hines and Mr. Alexander, and to the moderator. Now my question to the panel is that, seeing, well, with the statement of polls have life. When you finish the count of the ballots after the voting day, when you do the count, if when they finish doing everything and then they put out the statement of polls, remember those statement of polls are a thing, they think they are in triplet grades, or 4, we get 4, and you put out the findings on them and you send it. Now, when this statement of polls have gone up to GECOM through the channels from the RO and so, and it end up at GECOM office, and you take off the information of those statement of polls, and you put it in the big tabulation to get your winners, the various different to get the winners. I don't think that the statement of poll has life after that. Now, with this last election, the statement of polls were added up. Then they had a recount to provide the validity of the polls. The CCJ, when the matter ended up at the CCJ said that the 16 was only to be used for election petition and not to be used to to declare a president from Order 60. Now, Order 60 ended up in the court. That is what the CCJ, who is supposed to be our highest court, other than the Supreme Court, appeal, so you end up at the CCJ. And the CCJ instructed that Order 60 must not be used only for the purpose of an election petition, but instead Order 60 was used to produce the regime, the fraudulent regime. Now later down, when we went back to the court with the matter of the purpose of Order 60, the same person who used Order 60 to declare the fraudulent regime and have them in power decided that Order 60 was not good to be used for a president. And that is what has me a bit baffled, that if this same Judge Roxanne George could have said that Order 60 should throw out one and should cancel one, I thought that GECOM, being the autonomous body that it is supposed to be, should have said now that this woman has thrown out the chief, or whoever she is, has thrown out Order 60 that was created to prove what Order 60, because it proved who were the riggers of the 2020 election and how the rig. I think that GECOM should have stood up and said, seeing that Order 60 is not good, she should self-come and cancel Order 60. GECOM should have said, well, we want what we presented to you before Order 60, that APNU AFC won the election. And GECOM has never ever stood up in that frame. And I think there is where, to me, GECOM has erred to me. I don't know about the other people. But because if the same thing good or the 16 good, it is for a petition, well, nobody should have accepted a regime from Order 60. That is tonight.
You're saying colonization have gone back to the declaration from the 10 judges.
Yes.
All right. Let's give Mr. Alexander a chance to come in here.
All right. I may not have gotten everything clear, but may I remind the caller that there were two attempts at the order, and that the first attempt failed. And she may well be mixing up the two attempts in concluding that the order could not be used. The first one could not have been used and was not used. The court did not say the second one could not be used. What the court said is that aspects of the second one were only relevant to a petition, whilst other aspects represented, quote unquote, a recount that sought to determine the results of the elections. Given that the order was founded on a provision in the Representation of the People's Act, the Elections Act, I think, Section 18. Now, I heard something being said about the Declaration of Region 4. It's indeed true that each district, each region makes its own declaration. But that declaration does not constitute a final result until the 10 declarations are integrated into one report, which requires the chief elections officer to bring that one report to the attention of the chairperson before it is used for a declaration of the national results. We need to remember some things. When Do Not Sing was the chairperson, the law did not at that time yet provide for the 10 declarations to be compiled and brought to the chairperson before a declaration is made. And in 1992, I think it was, no, not 92, subsequent elections, 1997, when there were issues in relation to the results from the various districts, as the commission deliberated on that matter, Dudnot Singh left the room and went downstairs and declared and swore in Janet GECOM. After that, the law was changed to make it impossible for a chairperson or a CEO to do a declaration before bringing the results to the commission. So
there you have it.
It's a new regime.
The new regime, yes.
You have another caller, Doc.
Caller, you're on the air.
Thank you very much, and good evening to you, Dr. Hines, and your guests, the distinguished Vincent Alexander. And I want to use this opportunity perhaps more to make an observation, which I contextualized as a shortcoming of the CCJ. I say that because I believe when one looks at the rulings of the CCJ, consistent with the rulings of the learned Chief Justice of Guyana, in particular, the rulings that came out of the High Court, and one see that there is a significant level of synergy between the CCJ's ruling and the High Court ruling in Guyana. And in a recent analysis done by a team of scholars who were partly involved in the review of the elections conduct in Guyana, they have alluded to what they regarded as the disparities between the rulings of the High Court and the Appellate Court in Guyana, and giving some kind of tenacity, some kind of affirmation to the writings of the CCJ. My humble submission is that the CCJ has betrayed the intentions of the framers who sought to establish the CCJ as the final court in the Caribbean. It is my humble view that we sought as a region to establish the CCJ as a special court that will pronounce on the peculiarities of Caribbean jurisprudence and therefore give the region an opportunity to lead in jurisprudential reforms regionally and globally. Unfortunately, that was not achieved because we have a CCJ that rely essentially on legal positivism, and more particular on pure law theory, which subscribes to the view that even if a law is wrong, is bad, it is to be upheld until such time it is changed. The learned Madam Chairperson, former Chief Justice of Guyana, Chairperson of the Elections Commission, is also one who subscribes to that view and therefore did not take into consideration the reality that they are other jurisprudential schools. And I think that is the failing in terms of the CCJ and the outcome in terms of Guyana elections. And so my final submission would be that any reform of Guyana's electoral laws need to take into consideration giving to the Elections Commission the authority to declare, but also to avert an inconclusive election as we've had in 2020. Thank you.
Vincent, any comment?
Well, I will respond to that by saying that I do agree that positivism seems to be the school of thought that has informed much of the jurisprudence, much of the legal rulings that we have witnessed in the recent past. I agree with that argument. And I do share the view that if other schools of thought were used, then one may have had a different result. And in doing so, I think that that argument is far more relevant to the matter of Charandas. I think it is Charandas matter. If the judicial officers were prepared to go beyond the box, that there is sufficient legal theory and legal doctrine to show that Charandas had no basis upon which he can exercise a vote against the slate of which he was a mere guest, rather than his argument that he was representing the interests of his people. There were no his people. He was the guest of a slate and sought to use a vote as a guest, not just to change the decision of the legislature, but to unseat an entire government. And I think that there is legal basis for another decision other than the one which was made to have been made, if not for the conservatism and the sticking in the positive box by the jurists who dealt with that matter.
Yeah, and I want to come out in support of that. As a political scientist, I use the term conservative jurisprudence. Thurgood Marshall always talked about a living constitution, and that one has to always take that into consideration as one engage the changing times and the changing situation. And his tenure on the Supreme Court in the United States was marked by that, a reading of the Constitution and the law, not as part in time, but as part of a changing process. And I think English-speaking Caribbean jurisprudence is really stuck in that positivism, that conservatism that really hurts us in big ways, because when you have to rule on something as important as the presidency in an ethnically divided society that could explode at any time, you're really being exposed in terms of the conservative nature. I always say to our viewers here, don't say that Roxanne George is PPP. Don't say, I mean, I understand people into that, but to see it as she and the other officers of the law reading the law in a particular way. So thanks, caller, for your observations. And thank you. I think we have another caller.
We have another caller. Yeah, go ahead, caller.
Yes.
Yes, good evening, Dr. Hines and Mr. Alexander and the listening viewers. I have a question, two questions. One is, what is GECOM? What systems GECOM are currently put in place to ensure that what happened in the last election will not happen again? And number two, isn't it about time that GECOM invested in some technology in voting, such as electronic voting, and or maybe after elections have a camera view, the counting process, to ensure accountability, something to ensure that one, that the integrity of the voting system is intact and people's fears are allied when it comes to you know, the quality of the voting process. Thank you.
Vincent?
The first thing I would say is, you know, GECOM is not up to the task in some regards, because, for example, we've come out of an election and to determine whether or not things went right or wrong, we have not done a review. GECOM itself has not done a review of what went on. And you would know that it is standard operation procedure that at the end of an operation, a project, have to do an evaluation. We have not done that. And so GECOM serious institutional flaws. We are about to advertise for a research officer. And I have argued the case that one of the functions of that research officer has to be an evaluation of the elections once they have been concluded. And it shouldn't be a matter of us deciding to have or not to have. It should be a natural flow from an election into an evaluation, because that's the only way you know whether you've achieved your objective. It's the only way you can identify your flaws. It's the way in which you make determinations about how you can improve on your systems. Secondly, I do agree that there are technologies that could be used that could enhance the electoral process in Guyana. And I would say that GECOM has not been bold enough, and it's a reflection of the state of the political parties to embrace some of those technologies. But there are technologies, and we haven't. In fact, we have shunned those technologies. Some years ago, when I was the Deputy Registrar of the University of Guyana, experimented with some Canadian technology in terms of elections at the university. We actually used the technology that facilitated two things: an electronic count and an electronic transmission of the results. I know that at that time there was a weakness in the electronic counting system, because if the mark of the X was not done, if it was done lightly, the system did not pick it up, and therefore the vote wouldn't be counted. But I think they've improved on that technology, and I don't think we've been bold enough, and we certainly have to consider for elements of our elections, transmission of results being one, the use of electronic means. I do agree with that.
Vincent Alexander there, do we have another caller?
Yes, we have another caller. Docs, stand by. Go ahead, caller.
Yeah, two quick questions to Mr. Alexander. Are we going to go into our next election with the current chair of GECOM as one? And secondly, I want to know who pays GECOM, who is in charge of who is GECOM employer? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Vincent, the ABCs of GECOM.
I cannot pronounce on what happens. Commissioners, of whom the chairperson, in my view, is first among equals, are constitutionally appointed, and there's no provision for their removal other than for death, resignation, and insanity. So that as it is, I cannot show you a path to another chairperson outside of those three things which I mentioned. GECOM is a constitutional body and is funded by an appropriation by the National Assembly. But let me say that commissioners are not employees. Lots of people seem to think we're employees. We are not people who sit in GECOM 24/7 doing administrative work. We are commissioners. Our task is policy. Our task is monitoring and overseeing the conduct of the operations of GECOM, the greatest part of which is monitoring and overseeing the conduct of elections.
Thank you. Let me just say good night to everyone. Those of you who are joining us on CAMS TV, but there are also viewers who are joining us on Politics 101 site, and people who are joining us on YouTube. My God, all this time I keep forgetting that we have live viewers on YouTube, and I just want to welcome you all and to hail up to you guys, Pamela, Denise, and others there on YouTube. My bad for forgetting that we have an audience on YouTube. Leroy Nelson says here, but Professor Hines, to further expand on case law and Commonwealth jurisprudence, there are recent examples of constitutional courts in Kenya and Malawi ruling that where there are issues that undermine the legitimacy of elections and election day procedures, where there is that high threshold of presidential election, those courts throughout those elections and mandated new elections. No one had to wait for elections petition in order to challenge election day deficiencies. Vincent, very important observation. Vincent?
Well, those are different. Those are different jurisdictions, and so there's no automaticity that what happens there will happen here. Suffice to say that some of those cases were cited in the matters that were recently determined in our jurisdiction. That's all I would say in that regard, bearing in mind that we've already made the point that our jurisprudence has been rather conservative, and so some of those path-breaking decisions have not necessarily found favor in our jurisprudence.
Yes, and I think that's the point Leroy is making there. That those courts have been more in the mold of the Thurgood Marshall understanding of the role of the judicial system. It has not yet reached our shores or our Caribbean. Do we have another caller?
Yeah, we have another caller. Go ahead, caller.
Hello. Hello, Mr. Hines. Good night.
Good night.
Good night to you, Mr. Vincent. Hello?
Go ahead.
Yes, good night. We're hearing you. Good night. We're hearing you.
Good night, Mr. Hines and Mr. Vincent. Good night to you too, sir.
Good night.
My question is, I have two questions for you tonight. My first question is, how come Irfan Ali had been selected to run as a political candidate in the first place? And how come when he was up for as a presidential candidate, why he had become president, and how come he is in parliament as a president when he had 90 fraud charges pending? My question is, how come is that okay by the Constitution, law, and rights of Guyana? That's my question tonight.
Here's a question for you there, Council.
Our law does not, he wasn't found guilty at the time when he was contesting, and our law does not debar someone who has matters pending from contesting. So that's the legal framework within which he contested. And you should further note that having become president, that if I'm not mistaken, the Director of Public Prosecution stepped in
Yes.
and did something that's very novel. The Director of Public Prosecution could have simply suspended the matter until such time as he's no longer president. But the Director of Public Prosecution completely withdrew the cases, and not only against him, but against other state officials. That is, in some regards, irregular, particularly in another instance, where it is the Director of Public Prosecution who advised that the charges be laid. And in the other instance, not only were the charges laid, but the magistrate court determined that there was sufficient ground to proceed with the charges. That was challenged. The High Court determined that there was sufficient ground to proceed with the charges, and yet the DPP, at a subsequent time, withdrew those charges. So there are things that are highly questionable, which indeed have occurred. Unfortunately, there are no legal mechanisms that have been thought of. Because sometimes there are things that can be done, but there are no legal mechanisms that have been thought of to address those issues, which clearly suggest that if not illegal, certainly immoral.
Immoral. We're going to take a couple more calls, Mr. Operator, and then wrap up for the night.
We have a caller. Go ahead, caller.
Hello, good night, Mr. Hines. Good night, Mr. Alexander. My question to Mr. Alexander is, one, if GECOM dismiss Louis Fee and the others, why is it that a thing cannot be dismissed? Because she now come out and say APNU had won this election. So therefore, she not trusted to sit there as the chairperson, because we would always have this kind of problem with every election. So I want to know if there's not a law that you could take her before the court now, because it come from her, that yes, APNU had won, but her hands were tied. Come on, this is a nation we're talking about here. And if she can be so biased, then how could we trust her to go into the next election with her there? That's my question to you, sir.
Vincent? And you
All
know,
right, two
and
things
you
I
know,
would
and
say.
you know that's a,
I
you
would
know
not-
that's a West Indian. Mr. Alexander, you remember that calypso, Vincent? I am Mistress Alexander. and my husband is an oyster.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I would not ascribe the declaration of the result solely to Claudette Singh. It is the commission which, for all intents and purposes, declared the result, although the commission did not have a consensus on the matter, but there was a declaration based on 4 out of
I think we've lost Vincent there for a minute. He's going to come back on anytime now.
We have a caller, though, Dr. Hines.
Okay, let's take the caller while Vincent is.
Go ahead, caller.
All right, thank you. Hi, good evening, Dr. Hines. My question is, I wanted to ask Mr. Alexander, who are the persons that draft such a contract, or for these election officers that have been placed before the court, a contract that is, you could be dismissed according to votes. And we know how GECOMs run. where political interference is the norm. Now, if why such contract was accepted in the first place, that you could be dismissed just by votes, you don't have to get any evidence or being given due process. Because what now going to confuse everything, and particularly if there is a different outcome in the courts, that these officers found not guilty, what will be after then? What will be available after then for these staffs for GECOM? So it's kind of bothered me to know why, in the first place, a contract that whereby your future is relying on votes and you don't have to get due process. Who are the person that come up with such contract, and why it been accepted in the first place for persons who have to work
First of all, let me
GECOM? Yeah, that's my question.
all right. First of all, let me say the employees were not dismissed. I'd like to be clear on the use of these terminologies. They were not dismissed. The dismissal is tantamount to disciplinary action, where something goes into your file saying that for wrongdoing or something, you were sent off. These employees were terminated with their benefits. But your question is valid. In Guyana, it is a typical contract found in the public sector and in the private sector. If somebody can be terminated with due notice, either party can terminate the contract with due notice. It is just that in GECOM, somebody has to make a decision for GECOM, and that's the commission. And in this instance, it was made by 3 or 4 commissioners saying, yes, let's terminate, and 3 saying no. But it is a typical contract of employment in Guyana, not only in GECOM, in the public service where the people are not tenured with their contract, in the public sector, in the private sector. It does provide for termination with notice. What you're saying is that in a sensitive place like GECOM, given the partisan politics, we should probably look for a different approach to protect people in those jobs. The question would then arise that has arisen in today's discussion. People have asked, well, why can't Claudia go home? In a sense, she has tenure. So that's the other end of the pole, that you may have a situation where you say, well, this person did wrong, but you can't knock them out. So I don't think we have found the middle ground on that matter, but the contract was certainly one that is typical and provides for not dismissal. Dismissal would have required due process. They withdrew from that and opted for termination because the contract does provide for termination without notice, with notice. But I must say that in the specific case of Lowenfield, I was of the view that his contract did not have that provision, and therefore he was wrongfully terminated, so to speak, because that provision was not in his contract. But that's a matter that GECOM having taken this action, it's a matter for Lowenfield to litigate if he feels the way in which I feel.
Thank you, Vincent. And I think we've come to program time. If there is not an urgent call on the line, is there one, Andrew?
That's it. No more call.
Okay, so there we have it. Vincent, there seems to be quite a demand for the document that you reference. There's a suggestion, a couple of suggestions here that it should go online. Somebody from Region 6 is saying they would like to have a copy of the document. Somebody from a CARICOM country, and they're asking whether it can be made available online.
All right, I would explore immediately the possibility of putting it online. I myself don't have, I'd probably have to use the Burnham Foundation website.
The Burnham Foundation website, yeah.
and I will immediately explore that possibility.
Okay, once the Burnham Foundation has a website, right?
Yes, it does have.
Yes, once you upload it there, please let me know because there's quite a demand for it.
I will let you know. It will be Burnham Foundation, burnhamfoundation.org.gy.
Okay, burnhamfoundation.org.gy. Well, thank you, Vincent. I mean, it's been quite a program, as we say in Guyana, quite a mouthful tonight. And this is a slightly different program because it was informational, political, and so on. And we go off in that direction from time to time here. In fact, most of the time here on this program. And so the information that you've given us here tonight is quite an asset to the conversation that we have here in the evening. Thank you, my brother. And we shall be checking in with you from time to time as the situation unfolds there at GECOM. And I want to thank you, the audience, because you've stayed until the very end. You obviously consumed the information and analysis that was given here. And we take pride on this program, as you know, in providing that angle of the news and information. I want to apologize to you all for Mr. Harmon pulling out on the show yesterday, and that's why we didn't have a show. He said he will reschedule with me. I'm waiting for that. But on Thursday, my brother Lincoln Lewis is going to be here, and we're going to be talking everything from politics to GECOM, to the PPP, to the rule of law. The rule of law, why is the PPP? Why is the PPP getting away by violating the rule of law? Lincoln Lewis, trade unionist, political activist, and columnist, will be here on Thursday. Big show. See you then. Good night. And on behalf of myself and my operator, Andrew Weeks, the man behind the scene, getting everything done, taking your calls and so forth. He's very much part of the program, as I am. And to CAMS TV for allowing us this platform to do our thing here in the evenings. Thank you very much. And good night. See you all on Thursday.
Please help keep Politics 101 on social media and broadcast television. If you are in North America, please donate via Cash App or PayPal.
If you are in Guyana and the Caribbean and don't have access to Cash App and PayPal, email your pledge to dhines6106@aol.com and we will direct you how to get your donation to us. Thank you in advance for your donation.